Hello and welcome to this episode of Epochs, where I shall be continuing my narrative of the career and achievements or failures of Cato the Younger, and of course the grander story of the decline and fall of the Roman Republic. I think what I'm going to have to do is make Cato a three-parter. If Crassus got three parts, I feel like Cato really should. So what I'll do is, in this episode, take us through a lot of Cato's political career in Rome, all the way up to the actual breakout of hostilities of the civil war between Pompey and Caesar, and maybe a few details at the very beginning of that war, and then leave it there this time. And then in the third episode, go into all sorts of detail, all about Cato's involvement in the civil war. Okay, so let's jump in. So a little bit of a recap if anyone's forgotten or haven't watched the first episode yet. Just to remind everyone that the headline about Cato's career is that he's extremely unbending in his principles, to the point where he will damage himself or his own career, sometimes the career of his friends and family, and even damage Rome itself rather than compromise on things. And politics is the art of compromise in all sorts of ways. If you're too unyielding in politics, it will at some point damage you. One example springs to mind is the Duke of Wellington, the victor of Vimiero and Waterloo. After he'd beaten Napoleon, become world famous really, he was Prime Minister, but not for very long, for about 2 years if I recall rightly. And in the end he was ousted from power. His own party sort of cooed him because he wouldn't bend on certain things. There's a few certain political ideas and principles he had, and he would just refuse to countenance anything else. He just refused, point blank. And so in the end, it meant the collapse of his government and the end of his political career, or not the end of his political career, but the end of his time as Prime Minister. So that's how politics often goes, even in the ancient world. And Cato suffered from that. So for one example is, he's supposed to be very good friends and political allies with Cicero. But a few times he sort of wronged Cicero, or Cicero sort of wanted or expected Cato to do certain things for him or argue a certain way for him, in favour of him, and Cato wouldn't. So Cicero, I'll talk all about Cicero in the next biography I'll do Cicero. And his way, he was sort of a centrist or a moderate. He wasn't what we would in modern day would call a centrist, but he was a moderate, let's say that, in Roman politics. He was neither, obviously not an authoritarian and would have no truck with the first triumvirate, but also was prepared to blow with the winds a bit, was pragmatic, was a better politician in all sorts of ways. And every now and again he would think that Cato would do the pragmatic thing, sort of the obviously politically astute thing, and Cato wouldn't. Cato would stand on his principles, even if it meant it damaged his career and damaged their faction and wounded the Republic. And it exasperated Cicero in all sorts of ways. In fact, he said this in a letter to one of his best friends, Atticus. He said, quote, "As for our friend Cato, I have as warm a regard for him as you. The fact remains that with all his patriotism and integrity, he is sometimes a political liability. He speaks in a Senate as though he were living in Plato's Republic instead of Romulus's cesspool," end quote. Which is a nice line. Cicero calling Rome Romulus's cesspool. And if anyone would know, it would be Cicero. And so in the last few years before the actual hot war, the hot hostilities break out between Caesar and Pompey, there's lots and lots of political machinations and back and forths. And I'm going to leave a few things out of this narrative here, because otherwise we'll be going over the same things again and again and again when I talk about Cicero and then Pompey and then Caesar. So I'm not going to talk much about Clodius and Milo's battles, although they will be mentioned, but I'll leave that detail until the Cicero one, or maybe the Pompey one. But I do want to mention about parties and factions. And I've said a bit about it before, but it needs to be stressed here at the beginning of this episode, that there were obviously no parties as we have them, political parties as we know them, but there were factions. However, it's really confusing because you could simultaneously be a member of more than one faction and factions that were opposed to each other, and then you switch sides briefly and then come back and then switch sides again. And so it's very, very confusing. No one can really untangle it all perfectly. There's some examples where it's cut and dry. For example, Caesar was a committed populares and never stopped being a populares at any point. apart from when he was dictator and he did a few things that might not have been in the people's best interests, but there you go. Whereas someone like Pompey openly switched sides many, many times. I mean, like a dozen or more times. You know, Cato was neither popularis or optimate, but argued for and against both of them at different times. And so there's there's a layer of detail of this about the factions. But then there's other layers as well about family and about who or who isn't married to who, or who isn't a nephew or a cousin or a sister-in-law of who. So it gets really confusing, and these different interest groups, let's call them interest groups, completely overlap, and it's difficult to untangle. So that's something to bear in mind. And to throw extra complexity on top of that, you've got something like the First Triumvirate, or just backroom political deals that may fly in the face of all existing interest groups, and they're sort of secret. And so, as I say, it's difficult to untangle. So I said I'd mention Clodius, so let's do that bit then. So Clodius becomes a tribune of the people, which is really quite a powerful office, much more powerful than it used to be in antiquity. You know, after the Gracchi, the tribunate is a powerful thing. And although Sulla tried to cut the legs out from under it after Sulla, because we're now a good 15 years or more after the death of Sulla, the power of the tribune, the people's tribune, urban tribune, has sort of come back into vogue, and they're able to manipulate government in all sorts of ways. And this Clodius was a part of the Claudian family. He'd legally got himself reduced from a patrician to a plebeian, because only plebs really can be tribunes. So he had to sort of legally renounce his aristocratic credentials so he could become a tribune. But he did that and was. And then, of course, once he became tribune, he played all sorts of games, all sorts of machinations. And he's largely a creature of Pompey, Clodius, but only for a while. So to begin with, Clodius is Pompey's man, but to cut ahead a touch, after a while he turns against Pompey completely as well, completely turns against him. But for a while he's Pompey's man, and he's attacking Cicero. And in fact, once he brings a case against Cicero, Cicero basically completely loses his nerve. And I'll talk about this in detail in the Cicero one, but completely loses his nerve and goes about literally grovelling in the streets of Rome, like weirdly, to the point where no one has sympathy for him. They just think he's pathetic. And Clodius and his gang threaten Cicero with either, you know, a severe beating or maybe even death. And Cicero flees Rome and they burn his house down. I believe I talked about this briefly. Anyway, after a while, after the political winds change, after Clodius has turned against the hand that feeds him, Pompey, and he's sort of working on his own, it seems, people argue about that, it's not sure exactly what game Clodius was playing, the exact game he was playing, nobody can really tell, but he certainly had turned against Pompey. Pompey decides, and others decide, that it would be prudent to bring Cicero back. If nothing else, he'd be a powerful voice against these emerging gang wars. So they bring Cicero back, and Cicero, although he'd been a figure of ridicule when he left, was brought back and the people cheered him as though he was some sort of returning imperator or something. And it's around that same time, or shortly after, that Clodius tries to attack Cato in words in the forum, in the assemblies. And he tries to say that when Cato was governor of Cyprus, he'd embezzled loads of money. Because when Cato returned from Cyprus, he did bring back lots of money for Rome. He tried to claim it was more than Pompey had brought back from the east, but that sort of probably almost certainly isn't true. Nonetheless, he brought back loads of money for Rome, but none for his own pocket. None, as I mentioned in the last episode. But still, Clodius tries to besmirch him, besmirch his good name in public, in the court of public opinion, by saying he did embezzle lots of money. And Cicero stands up in the Senate and denounces Clodius, saying things like, Clodius is just a criminal, he's a thug, he shouldn't even have been a tribune in the first place, he used bribery and all sorts of nefarious mechanisms in order to be a tribune in the first place. So let's unravel all the things he's brought in, all the laws he's brought in, or he was responsible for. Let's repeal or undo all of those, because the whole thing was a hot, stinking mess. And this is really exactly what Cicero has been asked to do. This is what Pompey wants him to do. And you would have thought that Cato would go along with that. But typical Cato, is being sort of stubborn and difficult, doesn't exactly anyway. Well, Plutarch tells us that this is what happens. Plutarch says, quote, Cato contradicted Cicero while he was speaking, and finally rose and said that although he was wholly of the opinion that there was nothing sound or good in the administration of Clodius, still, if everything which Clodius had done while tribune was to be rescinded, then all his own proceedings in Cyprus would be rescinded, and his mission there had not been legal, since an illegal magistrate had obtained it for him. But it had not been illegal, he maintained, for Clodius to be elected tribune after a transfer from patrician to plebeian rank, which the law allowed. In consequence of this speech, Cicero was angry with Cato, and for a long time ceased friendly intercourse with him. Afterwards, however, they were reconciled. End quote. Now, I've spent a little bit of time talking about that incident because there's just quite a few different incidents like that, where people think they're friends with Cato, think they're political allies with Cato, feel like there's no possible reason why Cato would argue against them or be against them. But there's something in Cato's principles or values which force him to argue against them, and so he does. And so he loses lots of friends, politically anyway, by doing that. So although it's admirable, it isn't politically astute. I mean, in the quote I read near the beginning, Cicero calls him a political liability. Yeah, you sort of can't really trust him. I mean, you can trust him to do what he thinks best, but no one really knows what he thinks best most of the time. So in other words, he's a liability. You can't trust that he's always going to go along with a party line or a faction line. You can't trust that he's going to go along with even his own interests. So he's as a political actor, he is funny, interesting, funny, because he's like a wild card. Quite often he's a wild card. And there are lots more incidents in the political life of Rome where Cicero's just on the front lines, like trying to prevent certain people from speaking, just physically sitting between people in the Senate or in the assemblies so that they can't converse with each other and hatch plans together. There's just lots and lots of little details, interesting details, about how Cato sort of manipulates events as best he can and increasingly getting himself in trouble. But I suppose things start hotting up massively, sort of undeniably, after the first triumvirate re-establishes itself. And I've mentioned this, Pompey, Crassus and Caesar met in northern Italy at a place called Lucca to reaffirm the backroom details of their triumvirate, their power of three. And it's interesting because a lot of the sources, Appian and Cassius Dio and Plutarch, all seem to agree that no one really knew for sure that the first triumvirate was a thing until about this point. Lots had suspected, or those with really razor-sharp political acumen sort of knew it, but there was no proof. And yet after this, the events after this meeting at Lucca, it becomes pretty clear, and Cato finds himself in a position where he can just sort of start saying it openly. Again, there's no proper evidence. There's nothing written on paper. Obviously, there's no audio recordings of their meeting, but it's become so obvious that there's sort of no denying it. And even if you, and they did, confront Pompey or Crassus, they haven't really got a leg to stand on. They can sort of bluster and try and deny it, but no one would believe them. And the takeaway things from this meeting at Lucca, the biggest one really, is that Caesar gets to keep his command in Gaul for another 5 years, to be imperator in Gaul for 5 years. So the upshot of that is that he's immune to prosecution for bribery or anything else, or for being a triumvir itself, which isn't legal. It flies in the face of the constitution and Roman tradition and government. And Crassus and Pompey get to have another joint consulship, completely sewing up Roman politics, really. It is bad. It is bad. I mean, it is subverting. The first triumvirate really is subverting and perverting the Republic. There's just no doubt about that. So, as I say, many historians argue over when the Republic died, and a few of them say it's that meeting at Lucca where the first triumvirate was sort of re-established or reaffirmed. Some say the true Republic died at that moment when the race or the competition to become consul was effectively done away with, or largely done away with, largely subverted. So Plutarch says this about the meeting of Lucca in the life of Cato the Younger. He says, quote, Pompey and Crassus had a meeting with Caesar, who had come across the Alps, in which they laid a plan to canvass jointly for a second consulship, and, after they were established in the office, to get a vote passed giving to Caesar another term in his command. 5 years, by the way, was extraordinary. Usually it shouldn't be more than a year. Or maybe if there was an important war going on, maybe 2 years. So just to have a 5-year command, followed immediately by another 5-year command, I mean, yeah, to call it extraordinary is understating it even. It's unprecedented. Again, it's riding roughshod over tradition fairly badly. Anyway, Plutarch continues, giving Caesar another term in his command, of the same duration as the first, and to themselves, i.e. Pompey and Crassus, the largest provinces, money, and military forces. This was a conspiracy for the division of the supreme power and the abolition of the constitution. And although many honourable men were getting ready to canvass for the consulship at that time, they were all deterred by seeing Pompey and Crassus announce themselves as candidates, excepting only Lucius Domitius, the husband of Cato's sister, Porcia. Him Cato persuaded not to withdraw from the canvass or to give way, since the struggle was not for office, but for the liberty of the Romans. End quote. So I think, as I mentioned before, lots of people asked Pompey and Crassus if they were going to run for the consulship that year, and they were very coy and offhand, saying, "Oh, I don't know, maybe not. We'll see," trying to play it cool. But then when they had to sort of formally show their hand, everyone realised sort of what was going on, and everyone just gave in. They knew they're the richest, most powerful men, and there's no point standing against them. You're just going to create a really, really powerful political enemy for yourself if you stand against them. But Cato doesn't care about all that sort of thing. And it's around this time that Cato, obviously completely realises that there's some sort of deal has gone on between these three men. And he just starts talking openly and, again, bravely, really, I think, very bravely, just starts telling anyone that will listen, that, look, these three men are destroying the Republic. They mean to make one of them a monarch at some point. They're going to turn Rome into a monarchy again. They're going to keep giving themselves all the greatest commands, all the greatest offices, embezzle all the money, and they're going to basically kill the government of Rome between them. And now some people either think that might be a good idea. The old way it's been working hasn't been working very well for a few centuries, so maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. Many are partisans of Caesar, Pompey, or Crassus, so they're just on board with that project anyway. Some just don't believe him. Some think he's being a bit paranoid. Some think he's just saying that in his own self-interest. He wants to be the most powerful man politically in Rome. But many do sort of believe him. And after the Civil War breaks out, it does seem, a lot of what he's saying does seem prophetic. He's saying at this point, quite early on, particularly Caesar, watch out for Caesar. Caesar's going to end up dominating both Pompey and Crassus and end up making himself a king or something. Be wary of him. This is what's going to happen. If you give him another 5 years in Gaul, he'll come back so rich and powerful that no one and nothing will be able to stand in his way. Just be careful, just realise what's happening here. In fact, Cato thought it was so important to try and thwart this power of three that he does resort to sort of bribery and underhanded measures to try and get his brother-in-law, Domitius, elected to the consulship. So this idea that Cato's never, ever, ever unbending, never, ever, ever will resort to bribery just isn't true. As I said in the last episode, he obviously just made the political calculation that it's too important. The whole ball game is at stake here. If I have to bend the rules a tiny bit, then so be it. That's the way it has to be. Otherwise, everything is lost. And so it looks like that Domitius might actually win one of the two consulships. And Pompey and Crassus can't really have that. All their plans they just wouldn't work if that happened. They both need to be consul in order that there's no real political opposition against them in the Senate for passing through all the laws they'd agreed with themselves, least of all an extension of Caesar's generalship, his position as imperator at the head of the Gallic armies. Because if one of them have to share the consulship with this Domitius, who is really a creature, a puppet of Cato, then this Domitius is going to thwart them at every turn, just veto as much as he possibly can, and it's really not going to work. So it's crucial, it's vital that both Crassus and Pompey have to be the two consuls for the next year. And they kind of have to, or they're prepared to do almost anything to make sure that happens, including having sort of a fairly mask-off moment, including showing their hand, i.e. using just force and violence to get what they want or what they need, really. And many have said, and it's probably true, I think, that Cato played a blinder at this point, sort of forcing them to show their hand. Others have argued that's not a blinder. That's not a good thing. Maybe it won Cato a political battle at the time. It shows that what he'd been saying was true. It reveals Crassus and Pompey and Caesar as at least would-be tyrants. So Cato wins politically there, or in that sense. But Rome is damaged. The Republic is wounded. It's quite a bad wound. It's very, very close to dying now. So was that a great piece of politicking? Well, you make up your own mind. It's sort of both, isn't it? So this is what Plutarch tells us about when Pompey and Crassus, but particularly Pompey, really, because he's the army man, he's the famous military commander, how he shows his hand. Plutarch says this, quote, "This was precisely what the patricians of Pompey feared," i.e. that Domitius would sort of insist on running for consulship. They feared that would happen. "And so they set an ambush for Domitius as he was going down at early morning by torchlight into the Campus Martius. First of all, the torchbearer who stood in front of Domitius was smitten, fell and died, and after him the rest of the party were presently wounded, and all took to flight except Cato and Domitius. For Cato held Domitius back, although he himself had received a wound in the arm, and exhorted him to stand his ground, and not to abandon, while he had breath, the struggle in behalf of liberty, which they were waging against the tyrants, who showed plainly how they would use the consular power by making their way to it through such crimes." End quote. So Cato himself is even wounded by some of Pompey's men, some of Pompey's partisans. But nonetheless, their mask is off now. They will just intimidate and murder, if need be, anyone that's sort of standing in their way. They're not as brutal, nowhere near as brutal as Marius or Sulla, or perhaps even not quite as brutal as some other periods like the Gracchi, or the Gracchi's enemies rather. But still, the bottom line is, if they need to run you out of town at the point of a sword or kill you, then they will. When it comes to the most vital votes, they will do that. And anyway, it's enough to work on this Domitius. He decides that, he doesn't want any of this. He doesn't want to end up murdered and thrown in the Tiber. Cato's got sort of an endless reserve of guts and nerve, but this Domitius hasn't. So he decides just to stay at home. After that, that's plenty to intimidate Domitius. Plutarch says, quote, "But Domitius would not face the peril and fled to his home as for refuge, whereupon Pompey and Crassus were elected consuls. Cato, however, would not give up the fight and came forward himself as a candidate for a praetorship." End quote. But Crassus and Pompey don't want Cato to even have a praetorship, because then he would have a powerful position, still junior and inferior to a consul, but still up there, still one of the dozen or so, less than a dozen, most powerful men in the state. He would be right next to the cockpit of power, if not in it. And that would be uncomfortable for Pompey and Crassus, and they don't want that. So they're prepared to thwart his run to be a praetor as well. And it seems there wasn't much they wouldn't resort to. For example, there's a very, very old law, or not even a law, I think it's more like a precedent in Rome, that you shouldn't rubber stamp laws or have votes during a thunderstorm. The idea being, and this dates back hundreds and hundreds of years before this, that thunder and lightning, Zeus, he's in a tumult, he's in a tempest when there's a thunderstorm. And so it's just inadvisable to be passing laws at that time. Okay, that was sort of a precedent they had. But Roman politics had become so corrupt that now that was just used as an excuse. People would say, oh no, there's a thunderstorm, so we can't do any business today. We certainly can't have that crucial vote which we need to do. And then it got even more out of hand, where people just say, I think I've heard a rumble of thunder in the distance. And there wasn't any. They're like, no, but I'm pretty sure I heard a rumble of thunder. So therefore, we can't do any business today and shut everything down and we can't have a vote and everything's off. And that got used to the point of absurdity, really. And it's flimsy, isn't it? It's obviously flimsy to us. But even to the Romans of the 1st century BC, it was really fake and phony and flimsy as hell. And just a really lame get out. And so when the day of the vote comes for Cato to be made a praetor, Pompey just sort of thwarts all the proceedings, because the first votes came through, the first blocks of votes came through, and they came through in favour of Cato. And it was thought that largely the first votes that came through, whoever they were for, usually went on to win. Not always, but, very quite often. Like in the presidential election, if you win Michigan and New Hampshire and Ohio, you're probably going to win the whole thing. Same sort of thing going on. And so the first block of votes come through in favour of Cato. And so Pompey just pulls this trick.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.